Your upbringing was anything but ordinary and by no means easy. You were not just the child of a celebrity, you were the child of an iconic superstar who had a very distinct persona as this laid-back, sophisticated king of cool. Did you ever find it challenging to reconcile the person that the fans knew or they thought they knew with the person you knew as simply your dad?
He was Dean Martin, yes. He was the king of cool. He was my dad. Yes, he loved to play golf. He was funny. So all of those things. And really, I didn't pay any attention to, oh my God, my dad's Dean Martin. That wasn't something because we were brought up, I was brought up in Beverly Hills, once we went to live with my dad. And, all my friends, maybe it was Desi Arnaz or Lucie Arnaz or Tony Thomas. So we all kind of grew up with our parents being, absolute superstars.
I don't think a lot of people realize that you were only 6 or 7 years old when I Love Lucy went off the air. So for you to get to know who your parents were during that time in their lives, you had to do your own research, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. I had people who I knew loved me, so I didn't have anything traumatic, I would say, in my childhood other than divorce and alcoholism, which is traumatic, but it's not the same as child abuse or murder or anything like that.
Rory, your dad is a real mystery to me. He seemed to have it all: great talent, incredible good looks, fame, money, success beyond anyone's wildest imagination. And yet clearly he must have been fighting some very significant demons inside him. Have you ever figured out with the passage of time as an adult why he engaged in so much self-destructive behavior?
I have traced his childhood. One of the things that happened to him at the age of 10, he was abandoned by his mother. His mother left and she took his sister and left my dad with his father.
Now, Anthony, you are the son of Hedy Lamarr and actor John Loder. Your parents divorced in 1947, the very year you were born. So you were essentially raised by a single mother. Tell us about your childhood.
We had good times. And then when Hedy was on edge and when things weren't going smoothly in her direction, she was extremely excitable and angry, and they didn't have the medication that they have these days. So we walked on eggshells a lot growing up.
She knew who Bette Davis was and who the public wanted. And she always gave that to the public. Behind closed doors, that's the little Yankee woman who would polish her own silverware. Many times she was like my mother, my grandmother, my best friend.
If you could talk to her now, what would you say to her?
Thank you. That's what I said to her the night I met her after the show in Chicago. We talked for no more than 60 seconds. And I said something that made her laugh. And then she said something that made me laugh. And I said, anyway, and I'd already thanked her for the show and everything. And then I had to turn, she was she had finished her dinner. I didn't want to interrupt that. But the last thing I said to her was, thanks for everything. And that was the first time in 60 seconds the smile left her face. And with great solemnity and great sincerity and great simplicity, she looked deep into my eyes and she said, thank you.
Oh, wow.
Yes, he did. My father got the nickname during the war of Wild Bill. And when he came to Hollywood, he kept the name. And he did get in fights, and he did slap and actually spit on the head of the studio. And that's why, because my father was furious with him. That was one of his problems, but he also got in fights with studio executives, 3 or 4 or 5 more times throughout his days as a director.
Patti, you've lived in the public eye virtually your whole life. And clearly you made a choice early on that you were going to be your own person and speak your mind, which at times made you a polarizing figure. Where did you get the courage to break through all of the pressures and expectations that were placed upon you to conform to what was expected of a president's daughter?
I don't really think of it as courage. I think I just shot off my mouth too much, to be honest. And, looking back at the 80s, I don't regret necessarily what I said. I don't regret having spoken out in the anti-nuclear movement, which, by the way, I was part of before my father became president. It's just no one cared then. But I do regret the way in which I did it.
I do still have quite a few pieces. I have her original red Diamond Lil gown from the Diamond Lil revival. So I still have that. And if I can turn the camera and show you a gown that I have on display, if you'd like.
Oh, that would be lovely. Let's see it. Oh, my heavens. That's a very famous gown. What movie did she wear that in?
It's from Every Day's a Holiday.
Yes.
And it was designed by Schiaparelli.
Your father co-starred with every female star of his generation. Barbara Stanwyck, Loretta Young, Bette Davis, Kay Francis, Ann Sheridan, Olivia de Havilland, Myrna Loy. The list goes on and on. What was it about George Brent that made him such a great leading man for the most popular and powerful actresses in Hollywood?
Well, I think it wasn't a competition. He was a professional. In fact, he had this incredible memory. He could memorize 25 pages in an hour and never look at it again. He and Bette Davis both had photogenic memories. And so I feel that part of that and his professionalism from the early stage work, he knew how to make it work for them. And he was a very easygoing, person. He wasn't a moody person or difficult in that way at all.
The other leading lady that Joel McCrea is constantly associated with is Barbara Stanwyck. They made 6 movies together. What did he think of her?
He loved Barbara. And he always said that, there was no interest off screen. I mean, they were great friends, but there was never any romantic feelings or anything like that. But on screen, the chemistry they had together was fantastic. I mean, they were able to play off of each other as if they'd known each other their whole lives. Their pairings, some of those films, especially like Union Pacific, and some of those are some of the best films they both did together, I think.
You actually got to meet her at the Lincoln Center tribute in 1981. Can you tell us about that, Ray?
It was unbelievable. It was a dream come true. There I am standing in front of her. And I said, Miss Stanwyck, it's wonderful to meet you. I've come all the way from London. And she sort of looked at me and she said, oh, you're the one.
Now, Paul, of course, no interview about Eleanor Parker would be complete without mentioning her role as the Baroness Elsa Schrader in the blockbuster film The Sound of Music. Do you think she had any idea when she made that film that it would become such a timeless classic?
None of them did. The interesting thing about The Sound of Music, and this echoes an almost identical experience that Christopher Plummer had with the film. For years, she kind of resented The Sound of Music. She had what you, I guess, could call a love-hate relationship with that film, because the film was so famous, so beloved, that's all people half the time would want to talk about when my mother's name would come up.
Well, when Elvis asked you where you thought his career was at back when you first met him, you told him his career was in the toilet. Where did you get the guts to be so brutally honest with him?
To be honest with you, Harvey, I never was intimidated by anybody that I worked with, no matter how famous they were. I saw myself when I got involved with Elvis, and our first meeting was actually great, because I found, even though we were 2,000 miles apart from each other in our upbringing, etc., we had a lot in common. And the redneck that I was expecting to meet, I never met, because he treated everybody great and equally.
Now, as we all know, in 1954, Frank Sinatra won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal of Maggio in From Here to Eternity. That performance was widely considered to be the greatest comeback in motion picture history. But why did Sinatra fall into disfavor with movie audiences in the first place? I mean, in the mid-40s, he was the most popular film star in the world.
The rise, fall, and rise of Frank Sinatra is one of the all-time great show business stories.
Do you think your dad handled fame well?
Oh, I think he was amazing. I think it was extraordinary. He never said no to a fan. He signed every autograph. He shook every hand. He was never rude in any way to somebody who was so excited to meet him, and just open, really open. It was great. It had a great effect on me.
Did your dad ever tell you, son, I'm really proud of your success?
Well, to be completely honest, I don't really remember that.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's hard to explain, but the way my dad was, a lot of times my success threatened him. It really did, you know? He didn't want this competition.
You wrote that your dad was and will always be the greatest enigma of your life. Why?
Well, because he's so quiet, and there were so many wheels turning, in his head all the time. And there were questions I always wanted to ask him, but didn't until, maybe toward the end, I asked him, I said, how do you feel about people like treating you like such a star that you and friends? And he said, well, people go through that initial stage and then they get over it.
Well, now, Kelly, as you know, the last third of your book is really painful to read. Once your dad became ill, his wife, Charlene, began to gradually exclude you from having any say in his care. And she got increasingly hostile towards you, especially when you began to notice that your dad was not getting proper care. I don't think there's any other way to say this, Kelly, so I'm just going to say it. Your father was the victim of elder abuse, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And that's hard to say, and it's hard to agree with, accept. Yeah.
What was he like to work for?
Oh my goodness. The nicest man you can imagine. I was with him for 15 years in the 80s and the 90s. And he never said an unkind word to me in 15 years.
In 2014, the Doris Day Animal Foundation was throwing a big party for Doris to celebrate what we thought would be her 90th birthday, and found out later it was her 92nd birthday. There was always an age discrepancy with Doris. And she made her first public appearance in over 2 decades that night. And wow, I'll never, ever be able to explain to anyone that wasn't in the room that night. She wasn't introduced. She just walked in the room, and it was like the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan. I mean, the place went insane.
Now, one of the things that really touched me so deeply was the fact that Brian Epstein was good friends with Sal Mineo, who also died tragically in a gay bashing, and who actually had a premonition about his death in a dream that he told Brian and Larry about. And Brian Epstein was also gay bashed, wasn't he?
Oh, multiple times.
Multiple
yes.
times. And
people would take advantage of that.
And Brian was beat up in various different stages of his life just for being gay. And, the great thing about it is his mother really understood Brian and embraced Brian. He did have his mother's support. His father, not so much.
Your mother's life was often portrayed as tragic, and your father was portrayed as a nonstop partying country music outlaw, but none of those labels were correct, were they?
No, they really weren't. I mean, that's not to say that my mom didn't have tragedy in her life. Of course she did. And certainly my dad had his own demons he had to deal with. And he had, alcoholism was certainly a part of his life that was negative and horrible. But I didn't want that to be the only part of their story to be told.
Anybody will tell you that met him, he's the nicest person on the face of the earth. He'd give you the shirt off his back, and he had. And when we'd fly somewhere, Harvey, there'd be people at airports, and I don't know how they knew what airport we were coming into, but they would have stacks of albums, and he would stand there in the rain or whatever the weather was and sign every one of them. And I'm like, Dad, why do you do that? And he goes, because I know they're selling them so they can support their family.
Your mom co-starred with Marilyn Monroe in Bus Stop. You wrote that every time she talked about Marilyn Monroe, she cried. Tell us what it was about your mom's friendship with Marilyn that touched her so deeply.
My mother had this very traumatic childhood where she never really felt that she was loved. And Marilyn, as most people know, Marilyn's childhood was the same way.
Well, I want to just take a moment and pay tribute to your husband's monumental achievements. At one time, Aaron Spelling's shows accounted for 1/3 of ABC TV's primetime programming. What do you think accounts for the incredible success and the longevity that Aaron had?
I don't know. He had a special touch. He would read a script and he knew what he used to call it eye candy. He said, you know, I may not have a lot of Emmys for my achievements, but it's eye candy. I know what the audience wants. And he really did.
Now, Unjoo, I understand that you showed the movie to Helen before it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in 2019. Can you take us back to that day and tell us what it was like to watch this film with Helen Reddy?
Helen had been very supportive from the very beginning. She didn't originally want to make a film. And you can understand why, because we all know that Helen, I think that a film meant that it couldn't encompass everything that Helen thinks is important for her.
Well, and even though she was a very public figure, she was a very private person.
Yes. And then all of a sudden I realized I'm sitting in the theater, the lights go down, and there is the real Helen Reddy sitting in front of me, and she's about to watch a movie through my eyes.
Now, rumor has it that your dad hated to be called the Velvet Fog. Is that true?
I guess there was a radio disc jockey who dubbed him that, heard his voice and said, oh, the guy sings so smooth. But he's got a little bit of this kind of a quality to his voice, like the Velvet Fog. And it stuck. And Dad didn't like it because he didn't want to have a moniker, just, oh, I'm known as the Velvet Fog. But of course, he had a Rolls Royce and he had vanity license plates, and the vanity license plate said L Fog. It was PHOG. So he probably didn't dislike it that much.
It may seem oddly simplistic and obvious to say it, but you know, when people who achieve things are going through their lives, they don't know how it's going to turn out. When she came to New York in 1948, she didn't know she was going to be successful, and you know, she had a lot of doubt. I mean, she was very determined, but she had a tremendous amount of doubt.